There's no doubt that Ghostbusters is a classic comedy.
He slimed me. That's great!
I mean, it's not like the screenplay is bad, it's just somewhat unremarkable. It's a case where the finished movie is better than the script. And I guess I shouldn't be surprised. Ivan Reitman, Harold Ramis, Dan Aykroyd, and Bill Murray are all comedy legends with improv backgrounds, and two of them were the writers of the screenplay. Of course, there were going to be great changes made on set. But there was one thing that wasn't being changed on set. The concept of the story, and how that story was going to be framed. This is the kind of writing that happens long before a word of the screenplay is written, and I would argue it's some of the most important work a writer does. So that's what I want to talk about. How they took Dan Aykroyd's initial concept and turned it into the movie we know today. Essentially, how Ghostbusters became Ghostbusters. Premise and designing principle. If you were to take a screenplay and describe it in its simplest terms, you'd have the premise and the designing principle. The premise describes what the story is about. The designing principle describes how the story is told. First, let's look at premise. For Ghostbusters, I'd write the premise like this. 4 people in the ghost extermination business use their ghost-busting abilities to save New York City from a supernatural crisis. So now we have what the story's about. And from Dan Aykroyd's original draft to the final script, this never changed. So, what was the designing principle of Dan Aykroyd's original concept? Well, director Ivan Reitman described it like this. For one thing, it was set in the future, and it took place on a number of different planets or dimensional planes. And it was all action. There was very little character work in it. With the very same premise, Dan Aykroyd's original vision for Ghostbusters was wildly different. So, how and why did they change it? Well, partially it was just too expensive to make, but there were also very serious story reasons behind it. Let's listen to Reitman and Harold Ramis discuss the changes.
I always thought the movie should be a going into business story. You know, it's 3 really smart guys who go into some business. It's just a very unusual business.
Starting as parapsychologists working in the university, I think it helped bring the audience from a place of what's
reality.
Real to what's unreal. The credibility was established in the beginning.
They spell out 2 major aspects of the designing principle. First, what if it was told as a going into business story? And second, instead of taking place in the future across dimensions, what if it was grounded in our reality? If you take the premise for the story and apply this new designing principle, you get a pretty good recipe for the Ghostbusters we know and love today. So how do they execute this designing principle? How exactly do you make a film grounded in reality? There are many ways to make a story feel grounded. I want to point out 3 methods I noticed Ghostbusters using. The first is pretty straightforward. The movie literally takes place in our reality. We, the audience, are shown the Ghostbusters becoming popular via the same channels we would in our day-to-day lives, if it was 1984. News reports on TV, newspaper headlines, and not just generic ones. The script specifically mentions the New York Post and features real news anchors of the time, including Larry King. Secondly, it uses what Ivan Reitman calls
the domino theory of reality. As long as you took the people step by step through a series of credible choices, you could start to believe that this sort of stuff can happen.
The story begins with the characters in a very believable, humble starting place. Paranormal scientists with questionable practices operating out of the basement of a university. And gradually we buy into the story world more and more until there's a cute, quintessential American brand symbol looming as large as Godzilla walking through New York City. The last thing the script does to ground it in reality is make sure it has internal logic. I want to focus on one aspect of internal logic: setting rules for your story and following them. Specifically, the technique I call, whatever you do, don't do that. The very common storytelling technique is setting up a rule early in the movie that will be broken later. Ghostbusters has a classic one.
There's something very important I forgot to tell you.
What?
Don't cross the streams.
And when you see a character give this kind of warning, you can rest assured that, at some point, the thing is gonna happen. When I see it in scripts, I've started writing a little note. The BYDDDT. Because essentially it's a character saying, whatever you do, don't do that. It tells the audience to associate a certain value with a certain action. crossing the streams equals bad. So later in the movie, when their only option is crossing the streams, the audience recalls this rule and is as worried as the characters.
I have a radical idea. We'll cross the streams.
Excuse me, Egon. You said crossing the streams was bad. Cross the streams.
The problem with this technique is that it can be really obvious. In Ghostbusters, they disguise it in two ways.
I'm fuzzy on the whole good-bad thing. What do you mean bad?
First, they use it as a joke. Yet another humorous exchange by the always concerned Spengler and the amusingly carefree Venkman.
Try to imagine all life as you know it stopping instantaneously and every molecule in your body exploding at the speed of light.
Total protonic reversal. All right, that's bad. Okay. All right, important safety tip. Thanks, Egon.
Secondly, it's motivated by what's happening in the moment.
You know, it's just occurred to me we really haven't had a completely successful test of this equipment.
I blame myself.
So do I.
They're using the proton packs for the first time, so this is important information that's relevant to what's going on.
Start bringing him down. You got him. Don't cross the stream.
Maybe now you'll never slime a guy with a positron collider, huh?
Whatever you do, don't do that is a simple way for the writer to assign a value to an action, and helps ensure that story elements critical to the plot aren't being dropped in whenever convenient. By taking the original premise and changing the designing principle, the creators made the story more relatable. They grounded it in our reality and made sure it followed its own rules. All these things underscore an essential lesson. How you tell your story is as important as what it's about. And when the right concept meets the right execution, it makes for an unforgettable movie.